Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Okay. Yeah, just send them in my office. The file's already open on the desktop. Following you? All right. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining me once again as we are working our way through the book of Acts verse by verse, and that's exactly how we do it, verse by verse. We'll be in chapter 10. We're continuing verses 1 through 2, and we'll see if we get into the next section or not. By the way, I posted your notes, and so your notes for this and for the next section are already up. You can go to tgochurch.org, go to the right-hand top corner. It says Resources. That's a drop-down menu, and it'll take you where you need to go. All right. Well, it's just time of the year where summer is waning and fall is on its way, and pretty soon people will be coming back. And I know a lot of you that have been watching by live stream all summer will be heading this way, and we're just looking forward to having you back with us and worshiping with us and Bible studies and all the other events we have. We have a really exciting time coming up for this busy season for the fall. So we're really, really looking forward to it. So thank you so much for joining me today, whether you're joining me live or whether you're coming along on the archives. That's great. By the way, on the archives, let me remind you that you can go back and watch anything from Thursday or Sunday morning. You just go right back over to tgochurch.org, go to resources, and you can find everything that we have live streamed. So it's great to be able to go back, I think, and do that from time to time. I want to go back and hear something again or look at something again that we've done, and so it's fantastic to be able to do that. All right, let's dive back into Acts chapter 10 and verses 1 and 2. I'll just read both those verses, and we'll come back to our notes where we were last time. It says, at Caesarea, there it means Caesarea Maritima, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what is known as the Italian regiment. And he and all his family were devout and God-fearing, and he gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. All right, so we have this great story here of what's happening here as we're seeing this particular story unfold. Now, we've been noticing that there's a lot that's happening in this particular chapter, and we were focusing in on now the fact that as Cornelius had this vision, he's told to go get Peter. He's told to go to Simon the tanner's home, and he's supposed to get him and bring him so that Peter can tell him what he needs to know. Now, as we finish up last time, we were talking a little bit about Simon himself, and we were talking about the fact that he is indeed what is known as a tanner. And I was telling you that in the Old Testament, the Levitical laws required that if anyone even touched a dead carcass, a dead animal of any type, that they would be ceremonially unclean until they went through the ritualistic cleansing and then came back, and then they could come to the temple where they could participate in worship again. And I was mentioning to you that Simon the tanner then is an unclean person as far as the Old Testament law goes. So, as I was telling you last time, Simon is really at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to this whole thing of who he is and what he does for a living. Now, peeking ahead, just consider this for a moment. Peter is staying at the home of a man who works with animal skins and is considered unclean as far as the Old Testament purity laws are concerned. So, this is a very, very interesting event that's taking place in this story. And this is where Peter, the conscientious Jew who's had this vision of these unclean animals, now is going to have to deal with what's happening here. And so Peter learns this, and later on he's going to say, I should not call any man impure or unclean. And he will go on to say, I now realize that God does not actually show favoritism. All right, so I brought all of this back to make a larger point. Luke tells us about Simon the tanner because he's telegraphing something here. He's telegraphing the fact that Peter is already softening when it comes to his view of those that God is sending him to. You know, if we think about where he's been, in the weeks and the month before, Peter and John, of course, went to Samaria, which is this group of half Jews, half Gentiles. He went there to see what had happened when Philip had gone and preached the gospel, discovered indeed that these half Jews, half Samaritans had accepted the gospel, prayed for them, they received the Holy Spirit, and of course they had already been baptized. So that was, we could say, a small venture down that road. He hasn't really gone to what we could say full DNA Gentiles yet, but half Jew, half Samaritan, that was a pretty good start. And of course, now Peter has been through the coastline of the Mediterranean, and he's been to 2 different cities there, and he's been dealing with Grecian Jews who have become Christians. But now, God is preparing to send him to his first full Gentile audience. And just think about this. I mean, in past time, Peter would have offhandedly rejected any invitation to do that. So John MacArthur, referring to Jesus' statement that he would give Peter the keys of the kingdom, says this: there's one key left in Peter's hand that hasn't yet been put in a door and turned, and that's the key that opens the church to include Gentiles. Okay, so now we've seen this background now to these verses. So in Acts 10, verse 1, let's just read that again. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion who was known as the Italian regiment, and he and all his family were devout and God-fearing. Now, the first thing that we want to note again is that Cornelius lives in Caesarea Maritima, not Caesarea Philippi. In the first century, Caesarea Maritima was usually called Caesarea of Palestine because of its location and, of course, who was ruling it at the moment. The name Caesarea Maritima literally means Caesarea by the sea. So that's what Maritima means. So maritime, we use that word, we eventually get it into the word maritime, and so everything that has to do with mariners, the sea, etc. So Caesarea by the sea. Now, it was given that name to make sure that people would know the difference between Caesarea Maritima and, of course, Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is also a very, very important city at that point in history, but it's different from Caesarea Maritima, which is, in fact, a very, very great port city. Now, Herod the Great renamed this ancient city in honor of his patron, Caesar Augustus. Prior to that time, there was a Phoenician city there called Stratos Tower, and it really was there for a long time, existed as a port. But between 22 and 9 BC, Herod the Great rebuilt that city, and he built with it a great harbor. It was a major engineering feat of that time. And if we could have gone to Caesarea Maritima, we would have seen that it included palaces and temples, a theater, a marketplace, a hippodrome, as well as water and sewage systems. So this is a very, very modern city for its day, and a very, very expansive and wealthy city, because it is, of course, this port city where all of these ships are coming in and out, with all of that trade going on, all that merchandise that's being exchanged there. When it was completed, only Jerusalem was considered to be greater than Caesarea of Palestine. Now that's pretty amazing, isn't it? So if you think about it, the Jewish people would have considered Jerusalem, of course, to be the greatest city in the world, and their part of the world at least. But Caesarea Maritima was considered second, right behind it. So this is a very, very important place in the first century. During Herod's tenure, it's said that the city grew to a population of 100,000. So it was even greater in its growth than Jerusalem itself. So Luke tells us at Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. Caesarea Maritima was not only a great port city, it was also a Roman garrison that housed, from what we can tell, thousands of Roman soldiers. Now, one of the reasons why that's true is because Caesarea Maritima was not only this port city, it was also the administrative capital of the province of Judea. Now, we have to remember that as the Romans came in and they defeated the Greeks, and as they took over that part of the world, they also took over the various port cities, etc. So Caesarea Maritima becomes very important. It's got a big Roman garrison of soldiers there, which makes sense, because when we hear that Cornelius is a centurion, that he has 100 men under him, and then we have all these different rankings of Roman soldiers who have even larger numbers of people under them, it makes sense that that is exactly where Cornelius would be. So Luke introduces Cornelius as a centurion. Now, nominally, he's in charge of 1,000 men. In modern terms, a centurion probably corresponds somewhat to a captain or a company commander, as we would think about it in our modern army. So Luke says that Cornelius was part of the Italian regiment. So we have all these breakdowns now of these sizes, number of people that are there. So centurion has 1,000 men underneath him. He's part of this Italian regiment. A regiment comes from the Latin word cohort, generally consisted of 6 centuries. So we have a centurion with 1,000 men, and then, of course, we have a cohort, which is 6,000 men, and that's under the command of one officer. So we go from the centurion to the commander over a cohort of some 6,000 people. 6 centuries formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts made up a legion. So there we go. Now we have all the rankings from the century going up to the greatest part of this, a legion. Interestingly enough, the centurion's reference in the New Testament for the most part, make a very favorable impression. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because we would expect, with really the resentment of the Jewish people towards the Roman Empire, and of course, all of the Roman people who led that program, the army, the centurions, all of these leaders. When we think about what would have been normally a very volatile relationship, it's interesting that the Gentile centurions that we meet in the New Testament by far have a good reputation, not a bad reputation. For example, the first Gentile Jesus dealt with during his public ministry was a centurion who was stationed in Capernaum and possibly attached to Herod Antipas's security forces. Jesus said this about that centurion's faith. Listen to this. You'll remember this. Many will come from the east and the west and sit at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. In Acts 10:2, Luke goes on to indicate that Cornelius, of course, was devout, as was all of his family, and he called him God-fearing. He notes that he gave generously to everyone who was in need, and that he prayed to God regularly. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds like a very, very committed person. Even though he might be a Gentile, and as we'll see, he is really limited in how far he can participate in the Jewish religion, Cornelius really is a pretty amazing, he's an outstanding character. He really is. Now notice that Luke places Cornelius in the category of a God-fearer. That means that he's a Gentile who has identified with Judaism. Now, there's some debate as to whether in this story God-fearing is to be understood in the general sense that Cornelius was religious, or does it mean the more technical sense that he had accepted Jewish monotheism with its ethical standards, and he had also attended the synagogue services? So we're not really sure which he really means here. I tend to want to lean towards the latter just because of what I read about him, and of course what happens when Peter eventually goes to visit him. As such, Cornelius would have identified with Judaism as much as possible, with the exception of one thing, and that would have been the rite of circumcision. So a full Jewish proselyte, a Gentile who became a full Jewish proselyte, was required not only to self-baptize in the company of witnesses, but he was also required to undergo the Old Testament rite of circumcision. After that, you were completely bound to the Mosaic law in all of its elements. So Cornelius is described as a God-fearer, most likely because he has taken all of the steps except for that one. And that was not unusual for his day. There were a lot of Gentiles who became Jewish proselytes, but were unwilling to take that last step, that really great formal part of that proselytization. So some just did not do that. So they were known as God-fearers rather than full Jewish proselytes. But notice that Luke also notes that Cornelius' family all followed in his footsteps. So this is a great example, isn't it? Even though he's a Gentile and he's a God-fearer, from his father down to all the rest of the family, they are all following in this same pattern. So because of that, Luke can tell us that Cornelius and all of his family were devout, that they were generous, that they were people of prayer. This is just a very, very unusual man in a very unusual story as we're going to see this thing unfold. Now in verse 22, Luke will note that Cornelius was respected by all the Jewish people. Still, with all of this going for him, he was still a Gentile. He was still an outsider. He was still, as much as he might be doing these things, he was still restricted from a lot of parts of the Jewish covenant and even Jewish expression of worship. You know, there's a statement that Paul makes when he talks about Jesus coming, and he says he had broken down the middle wall of division. I don't know if you realize this, but in Solomon's temple, in the second temple, Herod's temple, there was actually a knee-high wall that separated the Gentile court from the Jewish court. So while Gentiles could go to that part of the temple compound, there was a wall that reminded them that they were to stay in their boundaries. That's kind of really a great picture of what we're seeing with Cornelius. He can only come so far in Judaism before he meets that wall of separation. Now, I want to just kind of talk a little bit about this Jewish-Gentile separation because it is very, very important to this story. John Stott says this: "It is difficult for us to grasp the impassable gulf which yawned in those days between the Jews on the one hand and the Gentiles, including even the God-fearers, on the other." This is the case in this remarkable story. No matter how devoted and dedicated Cornelius and his family may have been, as far as the Jews were concerned, they were still outsiders. They could never fully participate in the Jewish religion because of that wall of separation with all of its codes, all of its requirements, all of its traditions. So that wall of separation that Paul talked about was still firmly in place. So perhaps one of the questions we should consider as we look at this story is this: did the Old Testament teach such a continuing view of a rigid, unmovable wall of separation between Jews and Gentiles? Many scholars and theologians have pointed out that, to the contrary, alongside the Old Testament oracles against the hostile nations, God's ultimate purpose was to use one of them to bless all of them. So we think about it. He called out Abraham out of ancient Mesopotamia and promised him that he and his family would bless all the families of the earth. Likewise, the psalmists and the prophets foretold a day when God's Messiah would inherit all of the nations. For example, in Isaiah 11, here's what we read: "In that day, the heir to David's throne will be a banner of salvation to all the world. The nations will rally to him, and the land where he lives will be a glorious place." If I go over to Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6, here's what I find: "Is it too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel? I will also make you a light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." If we go over to the King James Version of Joel 2:28, here's what we read: "And it shall come to pass afterwards, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh." So those are just some examples of the indications in the Old Testament already that God planned to use the Messiah not just to reach the Jews, but also to reach the Gentiles. Now, I do this all the time when I'm teaching this same class in person. And on the white marker board, I'll draw a big circle, and then I'll put just a little dot in one portion of that circle. And I remind my students that that little dot I've placed in this big circle represents the Jewish race. That's how small they really are compared to the rest of the world. So God, having this bird's eye view, this panoramic view of all of history, plans to call Abraham out of his Gentile world, from him create the Jewish lineage, and tells him, through you, all of the families of the world will be blessed. So not just that little dot in one section of that big circle, not just that one little people in a huge world of billions of people. God intended to use the Jewish people to introduce the law and to ultimately introduce the Messiah. So this is the reason why Jesus says it so clearly in John chapter 3. God so loved the ethnos. That's the word for world there. It means all ethnicities, all people. This is God's plan. God's plan is that he would reach the nations, that through Jesus, the nations would be pulled together to him. So given that thread that runs throughout the whole Bible, it's a tragedy that Israel formulated the doctrine of exclusivism. And in the process, for the most part, they blocked out almost any reference to the salvation of the Gentiles. I really think in the first century, had you been talking even to Peter and the rest of them, would they have grasped that God really intended to bring salvation to the entire world, all of those Gentiles? And I think the answer is no, and I think this is why we're seeing God break this down in Peter's life until he can bring him to the point that he can see that God really intends to save not only the Jews, not only the half-Jews, but God intends to also save the non-Jews. So what happens is over time, coming up to the first century, the Jews developed this real strong theology of exclusivism, that they are the only ones that count. If I go back to my little illustration of the big circle which represents the world and that little dot in one section of that circle, if we just picture that, if we just envision that, that seems pretty ridiculous, doesn't it? But that's really where they were. The Jews really felt like they were the only people on the planet that counted. They were God's chosen people. They were, as the Old Testament says, the apple of his eye. And so they had no room for anyone else in this story. As John Stott puts it, they became filled with racial pride and hatred, despised the Gentiles as dogs, and developed traditions which kept them apart. So by Peter's day, no Orthodox Jew dared to enter the home of a Gentile, even a God-fearer, even a proselyte, much less invite one into their own home. By that point in history, by tradition, really by social taboo, we could put it, the Jews were strictly forbidden to have common relationships with Gentiles. Now, certainly, they had to deal with Gentiles. As I've mentioned several times, the Jews had to do business with the Gentiles. The Jews had to pay taxes to the Gentiles. The Jews had business dealings, as it were. They sold and bought with the Gentiles, the Romans. They have all of this that is at play just because of where they are in the Roman Empire. But social, common relationship, no, not at all. Although a Jew might barter or sell to a Gentile, they were restricted from forming personal relationships with non-Jews. You know, the Jews call the Gentiles the Goyim, and it's just standard format for them during this period. You do not deal with the Goyim. You do not have relationships with them. And Lord, never, you hope that never will your Jewish son or your Jewish daughter fall in love with a Gentile. I think I've mentioned this before, but this is so adamant in their culture that we know from first century history that if a Jewish boy fell in love with a Gentile girl and married her, his family would hold a funeral for him. And from there on, he was dead to the family. So we kind of get a taste of that. We're going to come back to this and look at this even more later on. But there is indeed, as John Stott points out, an impassable gulf between these two cultures. So it's fascinating then that a Roman centurion such as Cornelius should have even become a God-fearer. It's really fascinating that even happened. As many have attested, centurions were by far battle-hardened soldiers. They were not generally of the cut of fabric that we're reading about Cornelius. They were not generally kind people, compassionate people, giving people, forgiving people. That's not the way that you are trained to be a Roman centurion. To break through those ranks and be given 1,000 men underneath you is a very arduous task, and it requires a lot of mental and emotional toughness to get to that rank. And not only that, but we must also remember that the historical context of Cornelius' situation matters here too. Roman society was by far multicultural and multi-religious. It is not uncommon in this day for Gentiles, Roman Gentiles, to have their own gods, their own personal house gods, as we'll talk about later. They actually carried them around. They had little statues of their gods. They had an altar in the home, just not uncommon at all. The Roman army by itself followed its own religious observances. We forget about that, but it's absolutely true. So, for example, when Herod is put in place there in Judea, when he is named really as the king of Israel, one of the things that Herod does is to go to the Roman Forum and sacrifice an animal on the steps. So the Romans have their own religion. The Roman soldiers have their own religion. The Roman army had its own officially prescribed days of worship and religious celebrations. They worshiped numerous gods, including at times the emperors themselves. But you know what? That wasn't sufficient for everybody. As John Stott indicates, such religious observances were utterly incapable of feeding men's souls. Roman soldiers who felt the need to satisfy their religious hunger looked elsewhere, some to Mithraism, some like Cornelius to Judaism. And so this is how Cornelius comes to this position as a God-fearer and is prepared to hear the gospel. Okay, that's a perfect ending right there. All right, we'll pick up next time with the next set of verses 3 through 8. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for today. Thank you for your word. Father, thank you for how much we can see in this as we take the time with it. Father, thank you that you desire to see the entire ethnos come to you, to be restored to you. And we're so thankful that you sent your son to do that. We give you praise for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday. You know, we always say, same time, same station. God bless you. Have a great day. We love you.